author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we're going to be examining the aftermath of the Trump assassination attempt and JD Vance being picked for vice president. Remember, this program is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. How will Donald Trump's VP pick JD Vance be welcomed by the masses? Well, that's a question that's probably on everybody's lips this morning. And we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donner, who follows these things with great interest and insight. Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Good to be here, Mark. You can't say it's a boring time across the pond in politics, can you?
It's really not. It's the Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times. They meant it specifically for us.
For such a time as this, as the Bible says, right?
So we're recording this not long after Donald Trump has announced his VP pick being Ohio Junior Senator JD Vance. And
let me just interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt. Yeah. Credit where credit is due. You called it.
I did. I thought it was going to be Vance. A good couple of months ago, I think I called that one.
I'm going to turn this around on you. Why?
Sure. Well, two things actually. So the first thing is why I didn't think it could be anybody else. And the second part was the inherent benefits that JD Vance brings to the campaign.
Sure.
Well, so do you want to start with the benefits or with why it couldn't be anybody else?
I'm going to be interviewing you here.
All right.
I'm going to play host for a few minutes here.
Sure. Yeah, our new interim host, Lisa K. Donner.
What did Vance bring to the table that say Scott didn't exactly grow up in the lap of luxury?
Sure. So here's the thing that's happening across America, as I'm sure you know this, because you follow the polling as much as I do, and we delve deep into the demographics of this polling, the crosstabs, who's doing what. And this election is a battle for the soul of the working class Americans. And now that's been something that's gone party to party like a ping pong ball for a long time. And then Donald Trump came along, there's the most recent iteration, and kind of pulled the working class in with him in terms of the jobs creation that happened. And what you have on the other side is you have the Democrats headed by Joe Biden saying that it's the rich who are benefiting off your backs. Right. But what you have here is you have somebody like JD Vance who not only identifies with let's be fair, the poorer people, because he grew up out in the holler, as they call it. If you've read his book, you know what that means. Or if you're from the Midwest, you probably know too. But you've got this guy who grew up in abject poverty, living a life that is so relatable to so many people who are a forgotten America. When people talk about poverty in modern politics, they talk about minorities. That's what they talk about. They talk about or single mothers, or they talk about black families, or they talk about Hispanic families. They don't talk about your Appalachian born, your hillbillies, essentially. Your Appalachian born, follow down that Appalachian Trailway, and nobody really has talked to them because there aren't any jobs there. And there's an expectation because of all the identity politics that, well, if you're white and you can't make it, well, there must be something wrong with you, without looking at what the general malaise that has swept working class America, regardless of race. And I think JD Vance brought that to the table because he showed that you can go from the holler, from let's be fair, a very dysfunctional family. If you know his background, it's a very dysfunctional family. A lot of love, but also a lot of trauma. And then you can go on to join the Marines, go to one of the most prestigious universities in the nation, if not the world, then become a successful businessman, then go on to become a senator, and now he's a heartbeat away from the resolute desk.
Well, it really is a rags to
American
riches
dream.
story. And I think Democrats have historically tried to lay claim to the working class American. They've been the party of labor for so many years. But I think that is turning, that worm is turning. And that's what has, I think, Democrats very concerned this election. Not only do you have a JD Vance who speaks to the average American, or even maybe the one that's really trying to pull himself up by his bootstraps. It's interesting, the book, Hillbilly Elegy, which is a must read, and the movie, there was a segment in the movie where he's sitting around the table and somebody called him a redneck and he said, "We don't use that term," and I thought that was very telling. He's happy to call himself a hillbilly, but he's not going to call himself a redneck. And, there is a part of America that these folks are very proud. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a steel worker. I can't say I grew up in abject poverty. I certainly did not. But I know these people, and I'm familiar with these towns that have been run into the ground largely by the hand of NAFTA, when Bill Clinton brought that in and just decimated Western Pennsylvania, decimated Ohio, decimated West Virginia. And they kept saying, "Oh, well, we'll give them new jobs. They'll be able to be computer programmers." Well, needless to say, that wasn't going to work, and it didn't work, and it hasn't worked, and it's not going to work.
Not when you can get computer programmers in from India, and you've got the internet, so you don't even have to bring them in.
Yeah, hello, this is Bombay. How can I help you?
It's the Karachi call center, I like to call it.
Yeah.
Yes, so let's talk about that line there, that Pennsylvania-Ohio line, West Pennsylvania-Ohio line. There's Howard Kurtz was writing on Fox News Digital, and he had a beautiful line, and he said he's something like, he's from Ohio, but he speaks Midwestern.
Yeah.
Now there's a big distinction here, isn't there, Lisa, between Ohio and the Midwest? But it's the language and the ambitions, I guess. The societal and cultural ambitions are so intertwined. You're from the area. Give us the information.
Well, it's interesting because being from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the southern part of Pittsburgh, actually, where not far away from where the attempted assassination shooter was from, we never considered ourselves Midwesterners in Pittsburgh. We considered ourselves kind of East Coast people. But then you go an hour west and you're in Ohio, and then you're really into middle America and you're really into the Midwest. And so it's interesting how people, view themselves, like I was saying, he viewed himself as a hillbilly proudly, but as a redneck, no, absolutely not. People in Pittsburgh didn't really necessarily consider themselves Midwesterners, but people in Ohio do. But bottom line, you can say, well, Trump's always had these people. What does he need these people for now? But I think you have a lot of poverty in the inner cities, and the inner cities have traditionally gone Democratic. They've traditionally gone blue. But I think that's beginning to change a little bit. Younger people, Black people, Hispanic people. Biden is having real problems, at least in the polls, pulling his weight with this. And that's the Democrats' bread and butter.
We're going to be talking those key demographics after we get back, just after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donna, here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Earlier in the show, Lisa and I were talking about JD Vance and what he brought to the table for the Donald Trump ticket. And we started talking about, Lisa, the various demographics for which Joe Biden is currently having some issues, let's say. And you mentioned younger voters, Black voters, Hispanic voters. And it's the young voters that I really want to focus in on here, because obviously young voters are of all races. So it's probably a better sample size to dive into. And why do you think Joe Biden is having issues with this younger demographic?
Well, let me just say, first of all, JD Vance is 39 years old.
Mm.
And that's an extraordinarily young age
It's
for,
the first millennial VP candidate, right?
yeah, I think you're right. I hadn't looked into it because, he was just nominated last night, but bottom line, he's a young guy and he brings a lot of fresh, new perspectives. And the problem is, Joe Biden isn't just old, he's struggling with his health. And so I think when you have both of those things, there's a disconnect between the young, vibrant, I'm going to live forever
Mm.
youngsters. I call them full head of hair craniums. Um, and and the older folks. And Donald Trump may not be that far in age from uh, Biden, but he certainly is in presence, in stature, and in the way he conducts himself. So I think that's the primary problem. Biden's not speaking millennial. He's not speaking Zoomer. And I think JD Vance can speak that with his eyes closed and one hand tied behind his back.
It's interesting you say that because obviously so many people nowadays get their information via the internet and specifically via social media. And places like TikTok and X, that's where the younger generations go quite often to
Right.
TikTok. And Donald Trump seems to be his campaign, sorry, seems to be doing incredibly well on the TikTok front because I think they've understood that there is a different language there. The Trump campaign seems very smart to me in terms of its tailoring its different content to the different
Yeah.
groups. And I think you're right that Senator Vance can make that kind of connection pretty easy himself. Whether he decides to indulge in the TikTok arama is a different question.
What wasn't it a couple weeks ago that we were talking, I believe, on this program about the fact that Trump joined TikTok and immediately, like within 48 hours, he got 5 million, I don't know if they're
Yes, yeah.
subscribers or what are they called on TikTok,
I
but
think they're called followers.
followers.
There.
Followers or
I'm exposing
subscribers.
my age there. I think
Yeah.
they're called followers. I don't know.
Yeah. You talk about exposing in the age.
My spacers, for
Um,
those who
but
remember.
But Biden joined TikTok and he only was in the 100,000. So people were ready and willing to follow Trump, even though he's almost as old as Trump,
Mm.
as Biden. But he, like I said, he presents an entirely different persona, just as Vance will present an entirely different persona from Kamala Harris.
Well, let's talk about that. That to me is fascinating. Specifically, I am so looking forward to the what I believe, and we've discussed this off camera before, Lisa, but I believe it's going to become the most watched vice presidential debate in history because you'll have Kamala Harris, who is not known for her eloquence, quite the opposite, in fact. And you have JD Vance, who, I mean, let's be fair, he's a super smart guy and he
Yeah.
speaks really well. Whether you like what he says or not, he speaks really well and he can argue well. Um, and the two of these are going to go head to head on a debate stage. I can't wait. I'm actually thinking about breaking my lifelong ban on popcorn for this.
Well, I'm not going to beg to differ. I think it will be probably the most widely watched, but not because of the participants, but because of the availability on
Sure.
streaming and, all the multiple ways people can connect in instead of just sitting in front of their tube. But there were some pretty exciting ones that I lived through. Sarah Palin was an interesting one.
Mm.
Geraldine Ferraro was a very interesting one. There have been some amazing lines that have come out of vice presidential debates, Lloyd Benson, I knew Jack Kennedy and you're no Jack Kennedy, things like that. So I think the vice presidential debates have been talked down a little bit, even though there have been some really fascinating moments over the
Mm.
years. But this
There
proved
have.
to be the largest viewed one. I agree with you there, mostly because of the availability.
Well, I think there's also the international interest.
Oh,
I think that's a key factor in it because uh, up until the last 7 or 8 years, foreign politics, for example, for people in England, well, it was something that happened. And, they've got their superstar Barack Obama president, or they had before that, they had your George W. Bush with his nuclear issues and
nuclear.
nuclear
You gotta get it
issues.
right.
I can't even say it wrong on purpose.
He talks about nuclear in Iraq
Yeah.
and Iran.
And so you had these, but they
It's a
were far off
Texas thing.
figures. But now,
Texas thing.
perhaps as a result of this intentional push for globalism, politics overseas becomes politics at home. And it's discussed just as much. The politics of the United States are discussed just as much over the kitchen table at morning breakfast time as British politics are
Oh,
in a
that's
British home,
interesting.
because it just dominates. So it's just so strange. I get phone calls from people to say to talk to me randomly about American politics, and it's people who I wouldn't think were even interested
Really
in British
dialed into
politics.
it. Yeah, yeah. Now
Uh,
that's interesting. I wouldn't know that. So,
mm,
Americans are traditionally very American focused or self-focused. I think you can tell a lot more about our system of government than we could accurately talk about with yours.
well,
I
ours
mean,
is a
we know
lot
it's
more
a
confident,
parliamentary
not
system and
competent.
all
Sorry,
that, but I don't think the rank
confusing.
and file American can talk you through how exactly you vote for a prime minister, that kind of thing. So it's interesting that they're so fascinated, but this happens to be a particularly fascinating time in American politics.
It does. Now, how do you think JD Vance is going to campaign between now and the election? Will he be focusing on the Midwestern or as far as the East Coast as you can get without getting to West? Do you think he'll be focusing on those areas, or do you think he'll be all over the country like Donald Trump?
I think first of all, there's a honeymoon period, but he's got to get on his feet pretty quickly. And I think, he sells pretty much everywhere. He sells in the Midwest. He'll sell very well among the East Coast elites going to Yale. I think I don't know how he'll do out West. I'm not sure about that.
Well,
Um,
I think sorry, that's a really fascinating point, Lisa. How will he do out West? Because the the alternative question, the flip side of that is, how will Kamala Harris do anywhere outside of Chicago? Outside of Chicago, sorry. Although Chicago probably pretty well. Outside of California,
California.
and I think that it's going to come down to a contrast between somebody who can appeal, as you say, to a large audience, and then somebody who most of the country sees as a West
Right.
Coast elite.
Right. Well, we talk politics for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but we have to remember Americans don't vote for vice president.
Sure.
It just really doesn't, when it comes down to it, doesn't really make a whole lot of difference who the vice president is. Only in a couple of circumstances can I think it probably put JFK over the top, picking LBJ.
Texas.
But people don't vote for vice president. So, he's got to learn how to play second fiddle pretty well to Donald Trump's first fiddle. And we know that Donald Trump knows how to play first fiddle really, really well.
The orchestra is waiting. Lisa K. Donna, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome aboard, Tim.
Always good to be here, Mark. Thanks.
So it's a shame that nothing happened in the news this last week, so we don't have too much.
Slow news week.
One of the slowest I can remember in recent history. No, in all seriousness, this was if you could apply a weighting system to weeks, weighting as a different weight, then I think this would really be swinging the pendulum in its favor here. I think this was a very significant week in history. What's your take?
Well, Mark, I want to take us back 18 months to November of 2022. Republicans had just lost a third national election in a row, essentially, because the red wave never happened. Joe Biden had reached his highest approval levels. Donald Trump had been trumped by Ron DeSantis, who had won a 20-point victory in his reelection bid for governor of Florida and was going to enter the presidential race. And Donald Trump announced his third attempt at the Republican nomination in Mar-a-Lago in November of 2022. And it was a depressing affair. Very few people showed up, including a limited number of his own family. The sense was he was running again because that's what he does, but that his heart might not have been in it, and that it was almost perfunctory that he was running again. Now you fast forward 18 months and you get this.
For those of you just listening on the radio, that's the New York Post front cover.
Front cover, everything's coming up Trump. Mark, this was entirely inconceivable 18 months ago. And if you go back to January 7th of 2021, after the Capitol riot of January 6th, I don't think anybody, including Trump himself, could have believed that he would be in the triumphant position he is in now. He was already leading this race and putting distance between himself and Joe Biden. And now, with the assassination attempt, he's turned from really a hero to a legend, from a man to a force of nature, someone who cheated death and undoubtedly will be changed because of it.
It's fascinating that you use the term hero there, Tim, because I know to a lot of voters he is. Obviously, to an equal number, he's the exact opposite of a hero. But there's something about the hero's journey story where one has to be brought low before one can be raised high.
Yes.
And it's an archetypal story, of course. We're all familiar with it through every form of media, pretty much. But it really seems that Donald Trump has defied the odds. And it's not just due to the assassination attempt. I mean, the pendulum was swinging poll-wise towards a Donald Trump victory well prior to that attempt. And I do wonder, of course, there was an added booster from the June 27th debate-ageddon, as I like to call it. I'm trying to get that word going.
Well,
nobody seems to be picking it up.
I think the genesis of this was, it all began with a thing that just got tossed out, which was the raid at Mar-a-Lago, which then became federal charges for possessing classified information illegally. And how ironic, Mark, that just got tossed out on the first day, the Republican National Convention. I mean, the way that things have fallen, it's almost like everything that went wrong for Donald Trump in 2020 is now going right for him. And everything that went right for Joe Biden is going wrong. And I've never seen anything like this. We entered this year, Mark, admitting that this was going to be a wild ride. But I don't think anybody could have envisioned everything that we've seen from a debate performance for the ages, and not because of its positive, but because of its negative. And an assassination attempt against a leading candidate in the middle of a presidential campaign. I don't think anybody could have envisioned this. Even those of us, and it's pretty much everybody who knew this was going to be a crazy, wild ride through the 2024 election.
Yeah, you wrote a fascinating piece on the day after. It's on the pages of libertynation.com. You can go and check it out. It published on the day after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. And it was a message in that article that hinted at something that you wrote again later on, that it was almost like an inflection point for America, because a lot of people weren't a lot of people who are witnessing this, they weren't alive the last time there was an attempted assassination on either a president or a presidential candidate. How do you think the world has woken up differently?
Well, Mark, having lived through both the JFK assassination in 1963 and, of course, 9/11 in 2001, this isn't quite the same thing because the attempt to assassinate Donald Trump failed. But the fact that it was done, the fact that it came within a millimeter of blowing his brains out, has to change the political climate. And it certainly has changed the country, except on the extremes on both sides, both of whom are blaming each other for this incident. But there was a depression, really, almost like a wet blanket that overcame the country after the JFK assassination and after 9/11, a sense of incredulity, like, how could this happen to us? How could this happen in our land? We had a bit of a sense of that in 1981 when John Hinckley almost succeeded in assassinating Ronald Reagan, and he came closer than most people realize. Reagan was also within an inch of his life, a fact that we didn't find out till years later, but it has an undeniably sobering effect on the nation. And I think you could see that in Donald Trump's face when he emerged on the first day of the Republican convention. You saw an emotion in his face. You saw gratitude in his face. You saw a change in his face that said, I'm supposed to be dead. I'm lucky to be alive. And I'm so grateful for it. And I think if you get shot in the head, Mark, your perspective on life is bound to change. And so is the country's.
There's something quite strange about how the reaction of Donald Trump essentially shaped what was happening going forward from that moment. It's almost like time was moving forward, and then it had an option to split on which way to go, in the same way that the assassin's bullet missed was Donald Trump's reaction. If he'd have been hurried off the stage, head bowed, I think the country would be feeling very different today than how it did, where he stands up, towering over many of the Secret Service people, raising his fist in the air. And it showed a defiance that I don't think many people would have credited Donald Trump with. But I think it also set the tenor for how the heart of the nation really reacted to it. So rather than just as you say, that wet blanket that clouded the minds after Kennedy's assassination, there was almost an exhilaration that he beat that, we can beat this. And that's for everybody, not just Republicans. We can get past it.
It's why I titled my article "Dodging a Bullet," because that's what Trump did. That's what the country did, because the level of chaos and bedlam and violence that would have happened if that Donald Trump had not turned his head 1 millisecond before that shot hit, because you could see the projection, it would have hit him right in the head, would have shattered his head. Somewhat like what happened with John F. Kennedy. But you know what? The image, the image of him standing there with his fist raised, his face bloodied, the American flag in the backdrop. Mark, that's an image people will be looking at 100 years from now and shaking their heads. You could never pay to create an image like that. You could never pay for the strength that accrues to you for having done that. You get shot in the head, and then you get up, you raise your fist, and you tell your followers to keep fighting. I don't know how you the left is trying its best to say he stoked this attempt through his own language. It's pretty much falling on deaf ears. They don't know what to do because, look, they just took the one issue that Joe Biden had left to run on was the danger of Donald Trump. That's the one thing he had left. Couldn't run on his record, his competence, his age, his ability to do the job even, but he could run on paralyzing people in fear about what happens about what would happen if Donald Trump became president. He has now lost that one remaining issue. And this election, if it wasn't over already, clearly is now. And as I said in my article, we might as well start planning. I mean, the transition to a second Trump presidency might as well start now, because you cannot beat what Donald Trump got out of that failed assassination attempt. It's something that will live for the ages.
We'll be back talking the other factors involved in this campaign after this short break with Liberty Nation senior political analyst Tim Donner. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the impact of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But now I want to talk a little more broadly, putting the assassination attempt to one side if we can, and talk about how the polls are looking, how his recent decisions, for example, the JD Vance decision, are going to impact what's happening in the election. And there's something particular that I want to pull you up on, Tim, because you're a polling guy. You understand the Electoral College. You understand the importance of the different states, probably better than anybody that I've read. And I want to talk about Pennsylvania here. Now, that the Keystone State, it's pretty crucial for Joe Biden. If he doesn't get Pennsylvania in the Electoral College, he doesn't get the White House, does he?
I think it's fair to say, as many have said, whoever wins Pennsylvania wins the presidency. Because it's possible for either Trump or Biden to win the presidency without winning Pennsylvania. But that's not going to happen because Pennsylvania is really a bellwether. It's sort of the pulse of the nation concentrated into one state. It's rural, it's urban, it's suburban. It's a very representative state. It's one that Trump won when he won in the election in 2016. Biden won it when he won the election in 2020. Pennsylvania is really, that's at the heart of this presidential election, which is why the fact that this assassination attempt occurred in Pennsylvania will play some part in who wins that state. But look, Trump was already winning that state. The Real Clear Politics average had Trump up in Pennsylvania by about 4 or 5 points. And this assassination attempt is going to not do anything but build that lead. It's certainly not going to diminish it. So Pennsylvania has always been, as Joe Biden kind of said about Donald Trump a few weeks ago, in the bullseye. It's the bullseye for Joe Biden, who has traveled to that state more than any other state in the country, other than his own Delaware, which of course is right next door. I mean, the Biden campaign has understood from the beginning that Pennsylvania is the keystone to the campaign. It's the key to winning the campaign, because it's also indicative of other things. If you win Pennsylvania, you're probably going to win Ohio, and you're going to be very competitive in Michigan and Wisconsin. Of course, Ohio is off the board now. It used to be a swing state. Now it's turned into a pretty much medium red state that's not really up for grabs anymore in a presidential election. So, look, Look, Pennsylvania will tell you who's going to win this election. If you have to look at one state to figure out who the next president's going to be, excuse me, who the next president's going to be, it would be Pennsylvania, no question.
So you're absolutely right in the polling there. He's the last time I checked it, he was Donald Trump was 4.5 points up there, which is outside of the margin of error.
Yeah,
really. And there seems to be no stopping it. I'm been examining the numbers there, and at the time of recording, the last time Joe Biden was ahead in a poll there was back March, the end of March, and he was 10 points up, and it was a Franklin Marshall poll, which is the local outfit down there. And
yes.
It was such an outlier that even the people who were desperate to have some positive news of polling out of Pennsylvania were loath to really put too much weight on this poll because it's such an outlier.
Well, you never know with these polls, Mark, right after the assassination attempt, where pretty much everybody realized that Trump was going to get a bump for surviving the whole thing and his actions and raising his fist and his defiance and everything else. But Ipsos put out a poll like 2 days later showing Biden leading nationally by 2 points. People look at that stuff and they go, are you kidding? Who did you poll? Were you just trying to make a statement with this? I mean, those kind of polls, all they do. I remember there was one in, I think it was 2016, showing Trump trailing in Wisconsin by 17 points, and he won the state. So, those kind of polls, all they do is damage the credibility of the polling organizations, and you'd think that it would do it permanently. But, Mark, Americans have a short memory, and we tend to forget the polling agencies that completely blew it before or got it wrong. And we say, well, we'll listen to them again. It's sort of like economists. They always get it wrong, but we want to keep listening to them anyway.
There's two interesting thoughts on that. One, there's a gambler's term that you're only as good as your last hand.
Yes.
So if they can get one thing right, they can say our reputation's redeemed.
In baseball, they say you're only as good as the next day's starting pitcher. So
absolutely right.
The same idea. Yes.
Yeah. And the other aspect I was thinking is polling, especially in an election year, it's almost like a guilty sin that people just keep going back for.
They just can't quit. They can't quit it. It's a habit. It's an addiction for many people. They have to look at the polls. I've been there. I remember before the 2004 election in particular, for some reason, I was looking at the polls like every 2 hours for a week before, as if that was going to tell us, as if a change of half a point in one poll from another was indicative that Bush was going to win or Kerry was going to win. That's just political junkies feed off that like lifeblood.
Political junkies and their lifeblood. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest, Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donner, and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. I thank you both for being here, and of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there, for tuning in each and every week. We do appreciate you. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.